Hi, everybody. Welcome to Pop Culture Doesn't Have to Be Popcorn. Look at how you use more serious topics within genre fiction of all sorts. We're going to be bouncing back and forth, looking at things all over the place. And I'm Chris Garcia, but you know that. But who's with me today?
Hi, I'm Jay Hartlove. I'm a novelist, game designer, theatrical director. I like to think of myself as a storyteller and a big movie fan. But I'm also hoping to talk today about this topic from the viewpoint of a content creator.
Okay, excellent. Now, I'm going to just open this with a sort of a strange monologue. I have two 5-year-old children, and I'm exposing them to the greats of Western literature, starting with Scooby-Doo and the Scooby-Doo movies of 1972. But as we were progressing through, we finally came to Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Right.
And for what should be an incredibly lightweight film, coming out today would be a massive statement. It is.
Oh, yeah. Punch a Nazi.
Yeah. That literally, there is an entire song which is getting the past to destroy the present evil. And it's a real, I was shocked at how much presence there was in it. It was not as lightweight and fluffy as I remember it being when I was a kid. Even Naboombu as a concept, this exclusionary force in which people are inserting themselves to solve their own problems, is very easily read with sort of a much bigger sort of, I don't want to say colonialist, but it's pretty much what happens when you insert yourself into a situation you don't belong in to further your own needs. And what happens when you have to do that for the greater good. And it's actually a really deep story for something that when I was a kid, I just drooled over because it was, there are magic things going and there are fun songs.
Yeah. Well, you also watched that before any of us were exposed to, say, the Harry Potter series. And so the idea of all of these little myths scattered around Western Europe being all scooped up into an actual world building the way Rowling did, was something that, it was just fun to see it up on screen. That here's this witch who's going to work with these old fellows who are trying to defend their town from a German U-boat. And, and it's like, wait a minute, where did that come from? I thought we were talking about chasing down some magician that was supposed to be giving classes. And it's like, and the movie takes these rapid left turns, as it were, to get to the point that they're trying to make, which is anybody can be brave, which is a huge theme that you try to get to. I mean, even Winnie the Pooh stories talk about, the value of bravery and camaraderie. I actually, I teach a seminar in how to finish a book, and people are always flummoxed at the idea that you need to know what your book is about. That's not the plot, mind you. That's not what happens in the book. That's what did you walk away from? If you're going to pitch something in the classic elevator pitch, you need to tell your prospective future publisher or editor what sets your book apart from everything else. Well, that's going to be that you're talking about more than all of your competitors are willing to talk about. And so you get to these themes. So you can imagine the pitch session that somebody had when they put together Bedknobs and Broomsticks. It was like, oh, we're going to start it off this way and then go here. And what we're really talking about is, these people who are willing to put themselves in harm's way for England. Everybody from the kids to the middle-aged people to the old people, and they all put themselves, they could have been slaughtered. It might not have worked out, but they didn't look back. They didn't blink. They just dove right in and did what they needed to be done. And yeah, it was. It's a major thematic film. It's and to my point about it not being popcorn is you watch a film about fending off some enemy, and at the end of it, you're left thinking, okay, well, that was an interesting plot. There were twists and interesting characters, but it didn't really say anything to me. And so you're looking at the empty bag of potato, the empty bag of potato chips going, well, yeah, okay, fine. That left some flavor in my mouth, but I'm not really satisfied. Bedknobs and Broomsticks, you think back 10 years later, you're like, yeah, I really like that movie. I think I'll go watch it again. It leaves you full. It leaves you sated. It leaves you with more than you expected. And that's what I'm thinking. If people want their stories to have longevity, if people care about their audiences coming back to either buy another book or to remember them fondly, there's no reason you can't be doing this even in pop culture, in comic books or movies or any medium you want to choose. There are tips and tricks that I think will get you there. But yeah, it's a great, that's a fantastic example. One that I wanted to bring up was in the science fiction genre, for example. You're talking about repelling enemies. Okay, so let's say you go all the way with that. Let's say you go all the way to the idea that the enemy is so bad you almost start looking racist about it, right? It's just like, you have to just kill them, right? They're bad. So you have something like Starship Troopers, right? Where it's all about blood and guts and glory and victory and smashing those bad guys. And then you have the same idea, though, but done so much differently with something like Enemy Mine, where, you met the enemy and you hate them and you want to kill them, and then life throws you some twist and you end up learning more about them. And by the end of the story, you're not just accepting them, you're celebrating them. And, people don't, think back 10 years later, oh yeah, I love Starship Troopers. Well, maybe some people will. Now, I want to go back and watch that movie again. But I've owned a copy of Enemy Mine. I've watched it maybe 6 times. I love that movie because there's just so much more satisfying going on.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things about Enemy Mine is that it was a great example of using the expectation of an audience against itself. And because the audience going in has been programmed to expect the aliens are always the bad guys. And when you start to question that, they are feeding back on themselves, realizing that as the characters are changes, so is their acceptance of this trope. Yeah. And I think that's a great. I need to rewatch it.
I have to just mention it. People are like, I gotta go see it again. It's you're right, absolutely. You need to hook the audience in some way that they're participating in the story that's being told. Either you're changing their expectations, or you're surprising them, or you're giving them more than they expected in some way. That you hooked them and you brought them into the story. They're really participating. It's one of those. The measure is, if a movie is not really engaging you and the phone rings and you get up and you don't bother putting on a pause because you're pretty sure you're not going to miss anything. Versus, the movies that you sit through, even if you needed to go to the bathroom when you sat down, you don't get up through the whole course of the movie and practically wet yourself because you can't pry yourself away from the screen. And that's where we want to, that's the content creator. I want my audience to wet themselves, as it were. There's a quote, right? It's like, actually, in my case of the book, it's that they never leave the bathroom. They just stay in there and read it, and they never get up. It's even with a well-told story, it's easy to get swept up in things like plot mechanics and to lose sight of the impact that the events are having on your audience. For that matter, it's easy to lose sight of the impact it's having on the characters. You'd mentioned something about mysteries, the Scooby-Doo. Okay. Scooby-Doo's got some great murder mystery stuff there. Okay, those are pretty decent murder mystery stories. I actually enjoy watching them when I and I can't find Murder, She Wrote on cable somewhere. And Scooby-Doo will do, right?
Oh yeah.
But with that sort of, setup, it's all about the plot. It's about the complexities and the twists and I didn't see that coming, or did the writer cheat me by not telling me what I needed to know before I got to the end? And it's rarely about character arc. It's rarely about anything that's going to really last. And so those are very much, the popcorn. I mean, get to the bottom of the empty bag of chips and you're like, okay, that was satisfying. Next. And you don't really go back. I mean, I used to watch Murder, She Wrote in its original broadcast. How old am I? And I thought, this is great stuff, but I could never remember one episode to the next. They were all, the formula was cool. It was fun to watch, but it was a bag of chips or popcorn. On the other hand, you can have stories where even with a puzzle box, you end up saying so much more. Sometimes whether it's character driven, I guess, but it doesn't have to be entirely character driven. When I was thinking about this panel, I started thinking, well, I'm going to end up saying everything has to be character driven, and that's not true. There are actually character driven stories where it doesn't work. I'm going to commit blasphemy right here on the air. Jane Austen's Emma. It's character driven. It's entirely character driven, and at the end of it, you're left with nothing but an empty bag.
Yeah,
because
totally agree with you on that.
The story should have been, it should have been, or could have been, about redeeming yourself. It could have been about how her meddlesome ways, she learned her lesson, and she redeemed herself somehow, and came away with an arc. But she ends up getting the guy anyway. She ruins a bunch of people's lives, runs back into her house, and she ends up getting the guy because he was there for her all along. And there's no actual redemption. And I like, wait a minute, did you miss a bet here? Did you lose some notes when this was transcribed or something? It just doesn't happen. And so it ends up being sort of an empty story because you never really drag the audience in with that redemption arc. So, it's a thing. You mentioned genres and things. I like to think that this applies a lot of other places too. One of my favorite examples is Casablanca. Everybody knows Casablanca, right? It has plot twists, it has noir, it has suspense, it has plenty of things going on. But it turns out none of that is what the story is about. The story is about sacrificing your own happiness for something greater than yourself. And you see it coming, but you really don't get there until the third act. And it's like, wow, this story has got a lot more meat on the bones than I thought. I thought it was going to be some, fun little, suspense mystery thing, all the whole, romance with, punch a Nazi or whatever, right? But it turns out to be about so much more. And I just missed that. I think, and I don't think it's difficult to do. You just have to plan for it. You have to think about it and say, I want to tell a bigger story.
And you can go overboard. And the best example I can come up with that is the film They Live. A film that is 100% message. And yet, the only thing people remember about it is the fight scene. Still the greatest fight scene that ever happened. But it is, the message hits so often and so hard and so obviously that it overwhelms you. Although it is Roddy Piper's best film by far.
Well, how many films did he make? So
about 30, oddly enough.
Really?
Yeah, he was in a lot. He did a lot of, especially direct to video films. He was very big on.
Okay, so we're thinking Cynthia Rothrock and that whole, the 80s cheesy straight to video sort of.
I think he was in a couple of films with Cynthia too.
I loved her. Me
too.
She was great company at 11 o'clock at night, but one of those things, right?
Yeah.
How fun. No, I actually hadn't thought about They Live in a Long, Long Time. And I guess you're right that it was a gimmick, but it was the message. You're right. And they kept hitting
Mhm.
it over and over again.
Yeah. And that's, and
Oh, very.
you can even do strong message and not hit it like that level, like something like, oh gosh, that Gattaca.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yes. Well, Gattaca
Oh,
let you know this was going to be a message film right off the bat. Um, that belongs in a whole
mhm,
subgenre of science fiction that I call paranoid fiction. Um,
mhm,
it isn't dystopian fiction necessarily. I mean, the shining seminal gem in that crown, of course, is the original, The Day the Earth Stood Still.
yeah.
Um, I showed that to my wife years ago, and she'd never seen it. And she looked at me and was just like, my God, the 1950s nuclear paranoia is just oozing out of the television set. I was like,
Yep.
yes, that's what it's about. It's
Mhm.
a product of its time. And I actually love the remake with Keanu Reeves because I'm a big Keanu Reeves fan. But I love what they did because it's not the same. That old paranoid thing really worked well when everybody watching the movie was already terrified of nuclear war.
Mhm.
Uh, People weren't terrified of nuclear war when they did the remake, so they had to come up with something else, and it was the environment.
Yep.
But I thought it worked. I thought it worked really well, and frankly, uh, Gort blasting you with lasers is nowhere near as body horror as being devoured by nanites. I mean, yikes!
Yeah.
I mean, mm. So
Mhm.
I think they lived up to their potential on that one. But again, my favorite scene in that whole movie is when John Cleese is playing him classical music,
Mhm.
and he changes his mind about whether or not to to feed humanity to the nanites. And it's
Yeah.
like, now we're
Pretty good.
cooking with gas.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a surprisingly good remake. I was actually very skeptical going in, and then I was like, okay, this works. Because remakes for me, occasionally you get a thing or a Philip Kaufman's version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
Sure. Yes.
but too often it ends up being like Lost in Space.
Yes. 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 And that's really at the heart of it. They remade Rollerball into a movie that I can't even talk about. It's the original film has so much heart. It was a message film. They hit the
Oh
message
yeah.
probably a bit too hard. It was it got self parody in places. It hit the message so hard, but it was so earnest. And then they
Mhm.
come on with a remake, and it's like they didn't hear that pitch that I talked about. That what makes this story different than other stories is what it's about, not necessarily what happens in it. And so you end up with a remake where they miss the point of what the movie was supposed to be about, and you end up with a flop. You end up with this hollow bag with the same label on it, but it's a hollow bag. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, it's yeah,
Highly disappointing, even for a guy who thinks the original is one of the finest science fiction films of the '70s. Uh,
yeah, oh yeah.
Jimmy Caan could do no wrong.
I agree. I agree. I agree. I mean, I liked Freebie and the Bean because James Caan was in it. I mean,
Oh
honestly,
wow.
I mean, he's a great stage presence as screen presence. I just love him.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's really about deciding ahead of time. All right, if I'm going to spend a year writing a story, or 2 years writing a book, or 5 years developing a play, or 10 years developing a movie, don't I want it to be about something? Don't I want it to last longer than
Mhm.
the hour and 40 minutes that it takes for somebody to watch it in the theater and then they forget about it? Um,
Yeah.
I just don't see how people can spend all the time that it takes to generate, you know, novel length or movie length content and miss the point that it's just going to be popcorn.
Yeah.
Sometimes you want it to be. Sometimes you want it to be. Um, fluffy comedies. I mean, comedy is hard. My God. I mean,
Hmm.
being funny is an art form, an alchemy all to itself. Um, but that's you put the effort in, and people remember something as being really funny. They may not remember what it was about, or they may not remember specific jokes, but they'll remember that they laughed, because so many
Hmm.
comedies don't really connect. Um, so I guess there's a payoff with comedy. It's different than thematic, but if you're telling a story, I just don't see why you're going to miss out, like on the chance to be remembered. Um, any other examples come to mind? Because I can talk about how I've tried to incorporate this idea into my own writing. Not that I
You
want to.
just beat me to the punch, because that's what I was about to transition
Okay,
to.
well, thank you very much. I should have waited for you to say, and Jay, how do you do this yourself? I was like, okay.
So Jay, how do you do this in your writing?
Well, thank you for asking. I appreciate that. We can just edit the other piece out, right?
Yeah, sure, it's fine.
Uh, the magic of editing. Um, if the phone rings, there's, some cat jumps up on your lap and barfs again, and you can just edit that out too. So,
That's true.
No, seriously, I spent far too much time thinking about writing literature when I started out. Um, and the first book took, way, way, way too long. Um, I had a mistake of writing the book and its sequel at the same time, as if they were interleaved with one another. And it took forever. I actually hired a professional editor, a freelance editor, to try to figure out what's wrong with this book. And she had it for like 6 months and line edited the hell out of it and came back and said, you know what, I don't know what's wrong with this book. You got some great stuff in here, but it's just not working. And I was like, wait a minute, you're the pro. I'm paying you, and you're telling me you don't know how to fix it. Turns out it was the book and its sequel at the same time, and I needed to actually pull them apart and say one happens before the other, and it's the book and its sequel, and that then solved the problem. But then I had to then I realized, oh shit, I actually have to wrap all that up in a third book, and I had anxiety attacks about the failed conclusion of the trilogy, right? And I literally I was having panic attacks. And I had to walk away from it for a year, and I went off and I wrote something completely different in a different genre, completely a fantasy romance, right? So I go from horror thrillers, and I'm taking a palate cleanser. I take a year off and I write a fantasy romance, and I came back and then realized what I needed to do, and then I wrote the trilogy, the conclusion of the trilogy. But even with the fantasy romance, I couldn't leave well enough alone. It's actually a story about race relations. It's mermaids and humans in this village, and the mermaid village is just offshore, and the two of them try to stay out of each other's way, but they've ended up hating each other, and they're about to have a race war, basically, when a mermaid weaver and a human blacksmith fall in love, and the two of them have to fix the problem. And so I challenged myself on a number of levels. I didn't have a villain per se. I had the whole situation as being the villain. So I really pushed myself to some sort of literary, test to pull this off. So it's going to be pitched as a fantasy romance, but it really is a whole lot more, because I really wanted to say something about race. This is before all of the current racial situation going on here. But the good news is we're not going to release the book until the end of the year. So I'm not going to be, white savior, come out with my book about race in the middle of all of what's going on right now at BLM. Let the right people have the stage. I'll keep my mouth shut for the time being, and I'll release my book at the end of the year as just a story, instead of me trying to insert myself into somebody else's narrative. I could have just written this fluffy romance, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. And the same thing with the religious thrillers. I ended up using the religions and the history of our own civilization as the backdrop world building for my magic systems. I've connected Qigong from the East with angels and devils from the West. And I sort of constructed this magic system out of things that people are already familiar with. And I ended up, again, having to tell bigger stories. The first book is actually about personal redemption. The second book is about forgiveness. And the third book is about justice. And it's pretty obvious as you're reading them that that's what they're going to be about. I mean, I'm not hiding anything under the basket. But yeah, there's lots of plot twists, and there's gunfights and plane crashes and magic and all the craziness that you'd expect from an urban fantasy. But I know people who write urban fantasy. I mean, I have a friend of mine who writes novella length. I mean, I want to call them novella length, but they're like 50,000 words or less. And she cranks them out. She actually makes a living doing it, and they're really fun. I read a bunch of them. But there's not a lot of character arc. They're popcorn, but they're urban fantasy. They do all the same things that my books do, but my books are like, you're exhausted at the end of them. I've dragged you through glass and left you with a message at the end that you're going to remember for a while. My critics have said things like, it has a moral core. Well, the chances of anybody ever saying that one of Julie's books has a moral core is vanishingly small. It's just like, it's not this, you don't find that in the bag of potato chips. So yeah, I kind of, have to do this. But part of it probably is also the fact that she can sit on the beach in Bali and crank these things out 2 or 3 a year. And I'll spend 5 years working after 11 o'clock at night after I'm exhausted, and I invite my muse in to keep me up all night. So my writing time is really, really precious. And so I'm going to make sure it counts. That might be part of why I do this. If I had all kinds of time to throw at it, maybe I'd be writing fluffier stuff. I don't know.
Now, do you ever find yourself, as you get into a work, finding that the messaging is changing as you're going?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. I live by a very embarrassing quote from Neil Gaiman where he says, it isn't until the second draft or later that you start sounding like you knew what you were doing all along.
Oh no!
Sometimes you just fumble your way through. You're like, I know what I'm trying to say here, but I just can't figure out where to start, or who should be telling the camera, who should be carrying the camera. You gotta get the words on paper before you can change things, and that's the whole thing. And that's, if you don't write it down, then you can't edit it. People talk about always spending some time every day writing. Well, you may be writing crap that is not going to make it to the final draft, but if you didn't write it down, you wouldn't be able to edit it. So it's you just have to stay in there. And once you've got characters you love, and you're living in their world and care about what's going to happen next, it's actually easy to just keep working, even if it is 11 o'clock at night. It's like, oh yeah, I get to go back there. Of course, the funny part is, the reader is then in the same boat with a fantasy romance, which is actually X-rated. I mean, it's sex with lights on. I mean, it's a man and a mermaid. Okay,
gonna happen.
It's seriously. I mean, I go there, and so when my now 15-year-old storyteller, actress who second guesses movies halfway through with remarkable accuracy, when she was 11 and I was still reading bedtime stories to her, she wanted me to read the Mermaid Fantasy to her. And I thought, I'll read it out loud and edit as I go. I'm not going to let her have the actual book. And so she got the PG-13 version, and she gobbled it up, and we got to the end of the book, and she said, that can't be the end of it. And I said, what do you mean? Didn't I wrap up all the plot? It didn't, the character arcs and everything. I mean, don't you think the story ended? She says, well, maybe, but there's got to be more. Are you working on a sequel? I thought, that's not the highest endorsement I could possibly get. It's like, I want more of this. It's like,
Mhm.
okay. And I actually don't have a sequel. It was a standalone writing experiment. But you know, if it takes off, obviously I'll you know, go back and live in that world again. But yeah, it's, you know, if you're having that much fun writing it, then your reader's going to have that much fun reading it. Is really
Mhm.
it. Is really at the bottom line. It's like whatever's drawing you back to it at 11 o'clock at night is going to draw them to keep turning the pages.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah. Now, uh, when you're coming up with your messaging, and messaging sounds so marketing.
It is. It is.
It really is. And that's one of the great things is, who was it that said it? It might have been Michael Martinez. It was someone at a WorldCon said, basically, the prose is the marketing for your story. And I was kind of like, huh.
Yeah.
But
Well, yeah, that goes back to the elevator pitch.
mhm,
If you're spending all this time with a story, you should be able to explain in just a couple of sentences why your story is special. And
mhm,
it's almost always going to be, what are you trying to say? Um, Albert Einstein said that if you can't explain it in a few sentences, then you don't understand it.
mhm,
Um, I think Bill Gates said, no, it wasn't Gates. It was somebody like that, though. Said, if you can't get excited about it, don't expect anybody else to get excited about it.
mhm,
So yeah, it really is. The words that you've been cranking out are all you need to convince somebody that it's worthwhile. You just have to read those words and understand what's going on. Um, and if you've got a popcorn story, say so. Don't disappoint. Tell them, I have this fluffy popcorn story about such and such. They can still buy it.
mhm.
They may have lots of people ready to buy that. So be honest. Um, but if you've got something going on, then you talk about the messaging. Sometimes the messaging forces itself on you. My musical, uh,
Mhm.
Mirror's Revenge, is actually a story about child abuse. Because being an abused child, I kind of needed to tell that story.
Mhm.
You know, when Evanescence came out with Bring Me to Life back in 1990, whatever it was, I saw them down in San Jose, and at the San Jose Convention Center, otherwise known as the giant concrete basketball court box, as the
Yes.
worst acoustics of any place on earth. And I saw this band, and I mean, they were like shattering the windows. It was so loud in there. But they played that song, and something clicked inside of me, and I said, "Jesus, they're talking about Snow White." And I got home, and I realized we're talking about child abuse. And I spent the next 10 years making sure that play happened because it had to.
Yeah. With fine results.
I had to say these things.
Yeah.
And so, you know, people, you know, go in and say, "Oh, it's a fairy tale," and "Oh, okay, it's an adult fairy tale. I've seen those, right? Even the ones that aren't X-rated." And they come out going, "Wow, what did I just see?" And then it sort of dawns on them that there was this much deeper thematic message about surviving child abuse.
Mhm.
I had to, but that, you know, so sometimes you plan it, sometimes it grabs you by the throat.
Hmm. Makes sense. And so once you have your your idea and what you want to say, how do you go about crafting what you are saying to that message?
You engineer your characters to be the best people to tell your story.
Hmm.
Even in a completely character-driven story, they have to be exactly the right people to be telling the story. And so the hell that you drag them through, the conflicts you throw on their path, the strengths that, you know, that they find, the resources they have, all have to match exactly to the story you're telling.
Mhm.
And if they don't, then go back and change them. You have to reverse engineer to make sure they fit, so that whatever they do in the story is believable. Because that's the one thing an audience will, even in the most cursory read, the very first thing an audience can see is whether a character is suddenly doing something that is out of character. So if you've made sure that they're the right person to be telling the story, they then help you tell the story. Once you've figured out their background and their likes and dislikes and their histories and their phobias and their, all of their quirks, and if they're the right fit for your story, then they become your partner in telling that story. At that point, you can be focusing on, well, I need to keep hitting this justice issue, or I need to keep and make sure I have this believable redemption arc or revenge, whatever. And they're there helping you because they're like, yeah, you're telling my story and I'm out for revenge. So let's get on with it. At least that's, every writer has their own technique, their own methods. But I do a lot of method acting. From a theater background. I'll stomp around the room and I try not to do this at 1 o'clock in the morning when everybody else is asleep, of course. But but you act it out. You occupy the character and you say, well, what would they do? And you can focus on the story you're trying to tell while they're making sure that you stay true to them, I guess is the answer.
And which brings me actually to an idea that sort of have you found yourself ever, when you started to write something and you're into it, where because of aspects outside of the work, events in the world, for example, how does that change? And perhaps the message reflects off of that somehow, not well. Have you found yourself having to rework even the guts of what you want people to walk away with?
Yes. Well, my thriller trilogy is set in real time.
Okay.
The first book is set in 2001. The second book is set in 2004. The third book is set in 2009. And so I had to research extensively and be ready to change things if I found that the technology wasn't there, the geopolitical background wasn't there. I needed to make sure that the story fit to where I had placed it, because it was important for the larger arc that it be in specific times. And so I was changing all sorts of things to make it conform, because you can you set a book in 2009. That wasn't so long ago. People remember what 2009 looked like. They'll remember what tech was available, which countries were at war, whether or not there were, certain natural disasters that I'm going to play off of during the course of the story. It's like, wait a minute, I don't remember there being a hurricane that wiped out whatever. It has to, and actually in my case it was an earthquake, but well, the second book in 2004 takes place right on the heels of the earthquake and tsunami that wiped out Indonesia, and so it plays a role in the story. And so if you're going to set it in real time, you got to pay attention. Even if you don't set it in real time, there is this notion that you have to be woke. I mean, you've got the sick puppies who are saying, well, you're telling a story set in the gung-ho 50s science fiction. We can go ahead and be gung-ho 50s racist. It's like, no, you can't. You just fucking can't. Almost all I find, quite by accident, I don't know, maybe I'm a lesbian in a man's body or something, but all of my protagonists are strong female. I don't know how that happened. They just turned out to be the right people to tell the story. Actually, not the protagonists. Often the protagonists are men, but I end up telling the story from the viewpoint of a strong woman. I just find that it works better for the stories I'm trying to tell. My detective in my trilogy is a middle-aged Black woman, and I made sure that her perspective worked. I've had plenty of places that I could have stepped that would have been bad for me to be telling the story through the eyes of a middle-aged Black woman. But I made sure I got it right. I did my homework. And I'm not saying that I'm trying to, replace her voice in the world. It's just she's the one carrying the camera.
Mm-hmm.
And she's the right person to be carrying the camera. This is the way it works out. She's a psychiatrist, and her clients come to her with these wild ass stories, and she always starts off thinking that they're delusional, and turns out they're actually telling the truth. They really have had encounters with angels and demons and horrible things, and so she gets dragged into these supernatural stories. Sort of the Kolchak effect, right? It's like, oh, this is an interesting story. I'll go check it out. Oh my God, it really is vampires. So I'm sure that had some bearing in the back of my mind somewhere. It's like as a storytelling device. But if somebody comes to you for help and you're a psychiatrist, you're going to care a little bit more about what's going on with their lives than just say a newspaper reporter like Kolchak. As much fun as those were.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, you have to be woke. And frankly, that's just a deeper toolbox. I mean, why wouldn't you want to be telling your story in a way that people aren't going to be offended? Why not hit all the right marks? I mean, you're doing the work. They're all just words on paper. It's all editable. You can change anything. You're not that invested. You just erase it and do it again. I don't see any reason why not.
Can't argue with that at all.
Yeah, it's not like you're building something, like you're halfway through building a house and you find out that the building code doesn't let you build this house. Then you're screwed, right? You're halfway through writing a story and you realize, wait a minute, white savior. Shit, no, can't do that. Back up, do it over. No, you can't do that. It's a learning experience.
Yeah, I can understand that as a writer, shifting values must be a major concern when you've looked at things and you put it down so much energy into it, and then you realize, wait, everything in the world has changed.
There are stories that pushed ahead anyway. I'm not going to name any names, but there's some very famous science fiction writers who have decided that they, being very famous science fiction writers, are going to tell this story about things that they know nothing about. And their friends, especially friends who are, shall we say, of the same persuasion as the story that's being told, tell them, who the fuck do you think you are? You can't tell that story. And they say, well, I'm the famous writer. I'm going to do it anyway. And they go ahead and they do it anyway. And then, they later regret it and bury that book. And you never, hope that you never find it in the shelf anywhere, because it is an embarrassment.
Of course.
This has happened, and pretty recently. So yeah, unless you want to have a year of your or more of your effort go up in flames because you just needed to be pig-headed and push something through. I'm a firm believer in slaughtering your darlings. There's another writer's phrase, that if you have a phrase or an event or a twist or something, and you just so love it, yet every time you try to fit it into your story, it ruins everything else in the story. Then chances are the rest of the story isn't what you don't need to change the whole rest of your story to make this bit work. You need to take the bit out. Tell the story you're telling, save the bit for later. Maybe someday you'll think of a place that it fits, but it just doesn't work here. Kill the darling.
Yeah.
And so I look at it the same way. If I find myself accidentally, white savior is the easy one, because what's going on today. I mean, I wrote this poem and I was really reluctant to even put it out, and I ended up only putting it out in a very limited way, because who am I to be picking up that microphone. This isn't my moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talked to some other creator friends of mine, and they're all suffering with the same problem. They're like, oh yeah, I want to go out and create something to show my support, but I have to be really careful about how I do it because that's not my microphone.
Mm-hmm.
There's a rule in theater: you don't touch a prop if it's not yours.
Yep, very, very true.
I wish somebody told Donald Trump that when he picked up that Bible, but
yeah. Well, that's actually an interesting question. Do you ever find that because of the times in which we're living, that the reception changes and that what you were meaning to say is no longer perceived as that?
Yes. Zeitgeist is always there as a schizophrenic shadow in the corner screaming at you. They're never going to get it. They're never going to get it. They're never going to get it. Or you should know better, or whatever. It's Zeitgeist is a bitch, and you can't let it stop you from telling the story you want to tell. If it's tone deaf, if it's going to get you in trouble, then you hope to catch yourself before you spent too much time working on something that's just not going to work. But if you want to tell a story and you don't know if a big audience is going to understand it or get it or care about it, fine, then maybe your story is destined for a small audience. You have to be willing to take whatever audience you get. I did not expect big crowds to come flooding to my Snow White play. I always knew it was going to have a limited appeal. I'm happy with the appeal that it had. I mean, over the course of the run, given I had 150 people at Worldcon look at it, but when we took it back to Vallejo and ran it for 3 weeks there, I mean, we were getting 25 people in the audience, and I kept thinking, my actors have worked so hard, they really deserve a much bigger audience than that. And then I talked to my other theater friends in the area, and they said, Jesus, you had 25 people eating your shows? That's fantastic. And I was like, okay, well, I feel so much better about it now. So, a total of about 400 people saw the show, and that's 400 people who wouldn't have seen it otherwise. So, okay, fine. So it's not going to go to Broadway. I'm not going to get, thousands of people seeing the show. But yeah, I spent 10 years of my life thinking about that play, and 400 people saw it. That's how many people saw it. That's it. I mean, I'm good with it. So, size of audience versus zeitgeist, the sort of I don't know if I really need to explain what I mean by that, but it's like whether or not the news that people are exposed to and the culture that they're currently working within, whether or not it's going to fit or not. I mean, you and I, before we started this call, we talked about how I showed my kids some John Carpenter horror films from the 80s. Mm-hmm. And I remember them being cheesy, but they were fun. Well, they're still cheesy and they're still fun. They don't have a lot of depth to them, but they are what they are. They're never going to get that giant fan following, but I think John Carpenter knew that at the time. He was having fun, and he expected his audiences to have fun. And enough people made it to the drive-in and had fun. Good enough. Yeah. But on the other hand, if I'm going to tell a major story about racism, like I do with Mermaid Steel, I got to watch when I launch that. We're going to launch it at Baycon in November.
Oh, nice.
Figuring that this is, what's going on now, hopefully will lead to the reforms that we're hoping to see with police brutality. But I'm not going to release my story about race relations in the middle of this period of time. It just would be completely inappropriate. People would be like, oh, you're trying to take advantage of, this being a popular topic. And I get trashed for it, and rightly so. It's not my moment to be telling that story. So we bounced it to the end of the year. Didn't change the story. I still love the story. I still love these characters. I still think there's something to be said there, but not now.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right. Well, I think we need to wrap up because I think we're at our hour.
Well, thank you. This has been great.
Oh, it's been wonderful. I love talking this stuff because you might not know this, but I talk a lot.
I think I kind of took over the conversation in a few places here. Sorry.
No, don't worry. It saved me the trouble.
Okay.
I keep talking, I get in trouble. That's
yeah, but you push a button and a writer will just keep talking. Well, actually, a theater person actually just keep talking. No, I just I don't want to say that I don't like popcorn stories. It's just there are lots of times I'll see, I'll be reading a book or I'll be watching a movie and I'll go, wow, I sure hope they go someplace deeper with this, and then they don't, and I'm thinking, in fact, there are movies that I absolutely love until the third act, when they didn't come through for me. It's like,
yeah.
I actually wrote a new ending to Jupiter Ascending. I was so angry. I was so angry. I actually rewrote the last five or six scenes of that movie just so that I know how that movie is supposed to actually end.
And that we'll have to see in the future. Excellent. Thanks so much. This has been great.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot.
Oh, awesome.
And happy NASFIC.
Thank you. And we're going to love it. Think of it, it's the first con where you don't have to worry about con crud except what you've already got.
Right. We're all hiding inside from the con crud. That's true.
That's beautiful. Great. Good talking with you, Jay. Wonderful.
Thanks a lot. Take care. All right.
See ya.
Bye.